Our first speaker is Lucas Champollion. Lucas is both a information science guy and a linguistics guy. He got a master's in science engineering, computer and information science from the University of Pennsylvania back in 2007. Got his PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania in 2010. And has gone on to, went on to do a postdoc at Tübingen, after which he got his current position at New York University, where he's been since 2012. He was tenured in 2018. Lucas specializes in model theoretic linguistic semantics, and his interests are fairly wide within that, including event semantics, conjunction, disjunction, counterfactuals, donkey sentences, free choice, distributivity, aspect, measurement, quantification, negation, definite descriptions, temporal dependencies, and other topics. In the natural language processing area, he works especially on tree adjoining grammar. He's published articles in all major journals, including Semantics and Pragmatics, Linguistics and Philosophy, Journal of Semantics, Theoretical Linguistics, Journal of Logic, Journal of Logic, Language and Information, and other places. He has several invited articles, including a Handbook of Semantics article on mereology. He's given talks at all major conferences, including SALT, WICFL, Amsterdam Colloquium, NELS, GLOW, and many others, and dozens of invited talks throughout the world. He's a reviewer for basically every journal that you've ever heard of in semantics, and we are very fortunate to have him here today to give us talk on negative events and truthmaker semantics. So we have about an hour, give or take, for the talk, and then a half an hour for questions afterwards. Okay, Lucas, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us either early or late, as may be the case, or even in the middle of the night. For me, it's 8 p.m. in New York, and I want to apologize in advance that I won't be able to attend most of the talks of this conference live, but I promise I will try and attend as many of them as time permits, at least as recordings. So I'm really looking forward to this conference, and I only regret that I can't be there in person. Chris, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. I want to talk today about some work I've done with Timothée Bernard from CNRS Paris. Timothée might not agree with everything I'm going to say today necessarily. So any mistakes that you might detect in what I'm going to present are my own. I'm going to share a handout on screen, and you can also find this handout on the Slack channel for this conference. Just bear with me for a second. Oh, if you hear my cat in the background, my apologies about that. I'm giving my talk from my living room here, and she's going to distract me, and hopefully not too many of you. Okay, here we go. Can you all see my screen all right? Yes, good, thank you. Thanks. Okay, all right. So I want to talk today about negation. Now, it's a basic truth about negation that if you have a sentence that's true, then the negation of the sentence is false. And of course, if the sentence is false, then the negation of the sentence is true. And there's nothing surprising about that. But like anything else in linguistics, it is a fact of language and it requires an explanation. So let's think about the explanations that we are used to from Semantics 1. If you think of an extensional system, then negation consists in taking a truth value and turning it into its opposite. It maps true to false and maps false to true. So if we take a sentence to denote a truth value, then we immediately have an account of this behavior of negation. If we take a sentence to be a set of possible worlds, that is to say, if we move to an intentional setting, then we can take negation to be the complement. The complement takes us from a set of worlds to the set of all those worlds that are not in the original set. And that too accounts immediately for the classical picture. That is to say, the fact that every sentence that's true has a false negation and vice versa. But now there is another view on the meanings of sentences that I'm going to build on today. And this view is the idea that sentences denote sets of events. Now, why would anyone take such a view? Well, you are familiar with events from the work of Davidson and many others in linguistics and philosophy. Davidson was perhaps the first, or one of the first, who suggested that sentences involve existential quantification over events, as you can see in 1a and b. So for Davidson, a sentence consists of two parts. One is an event description, which we can take to be a lambda abstract over events, a description of events, a predicate of events. In this case, a set of events. In this case, the set of all kicking events of Sean by Shem, or something like this. And the second part, according to Davidson, of a sentence meaning is the existential closure, which takes us back from this event description to a truth value. Now, what if this existential closure was not part of sentence meaning? What if it was part of how we interpret sentences? What if it was just what we add to sentences when they're given to us and when we are tasked with deciding whether they are true? Well, in that case, what remains when we take it away, this event description or this sentence radical, is what I suggest we should think of as a proposition. So I'm going to develop the notion that a proposition is a set of events. Now, we're used to thinking of all sentences as denoting propositions. Usually we take these propositions to be sets of possible worlds. Now we take them to be sets of events. Well, that means that all sentences should denote sets of events. Now, I'm going to build towards this view today, but I'm not actually going to defend this view in detail. I'm rather going to focus on a specific set of sentences, namely the negated sentences. So what does it mean for a negated sentence to denote a set of events? What is it, for example, for an event that to be described by a negated sentence like, it did not rain? So we know what raining events are, but what is a non-raining event? Clearly, it cannot be just an event that doesn't happen to be a raining event, because there's plenty of non-raining events in that sense. Any event that does not involve rain or the weather or anything at all, for example, an event of me giving this talk to you from my living room is not a raining event. And by that logic, it should be a non-raining event. No, that's not what we want. We want something more specific. We want to know what it is for an event to be a non-raining. Now, just to recall the motivations for event semantics, as Davidson has given them to us and as they are generally accepted in linguistics, modifiers like in the back, with a knife, and so on can be dropped, can be permutated, can be taken to denote sets of events. For example, in the back, with a knife, can be taken to be sets of events that are intersected with one another and with the set of events that is denoted by Brutus stabbed Caesar. This gives us the modified drop pattern that we see in 2, where 2a entails to b to c to d, and 2d is entailed by 2a to b to c. Now, one of the motivations for events that go beyond this modifier drop pattern has to do with perception reports. If we say John saw someone laugh, this entails that there is someone that John saw laugh. Contrast this with John saw that someone laughed. Now, this could be true even if John did not see anyone laugh. Imagine, for example, that John is paying someone to check if the audience laughs, and at the end of the talk that John gives, well, he was not paying any attention, or as in my case, he can't see anyone because everybody has their cameras turned off and they're talking into the void. Well, John might not be able to see all of the people that are laughing, just like I can't see you right now. Well, it might still be true that John saw at the end of the day that someone laughed in virtue of the indirect evidence that he gets from the intern's report. Okay, now what's the lesson from this? The lesson from this is that, as it has been suggested previously, when we say John saw someone laugh, we are taking an event and we're saying of that event that John saw that event, and this event involved some specific person. Now, when we say John saw that someone laughed, we don't necessarily relate John to a specific event. We relate John to a proposition, the proposition that someone laughed. And now one of the crucial assumptions that Davidson makes, and everybody following him in linguistics, is that events are fully determinate. That means even though we can say that there is a proposition that someone laughed, and this proposition doesn't specify who it is that laughed, we cannot say of an event that this is an event in which someone laughed without it being the case that there is a specific person who laughed in this event. One other way to put this is events are fully determinate. There are no disjunctive events. There are disjunctive propositions, if you will. A proposition can pick out all of the worlds, if you think of propositions as sets of worlds, in which someone laughed, in which John or Mary or Bill or Sue laughed, without actually narrowing down on any of those worlds. But an event is not like that. If an event satisfies the description someone laughed, there has to be a more specific description, maybe Bill laughed, which this event also satisfies. And this distinction between events and proposition can then be used to account for the difference between 3A and B, and for the fact that only 3A entails 3C. But now, there is nothing specific about laugh. We can replace laugh by not laugh, and the same kinds of inferences go through as well. But that suggests that if laugh denotes a set of events, and likewise for someone laugh, then someone not laugh should be treated in the same way. And so what I'm going to do today is build on the standard view according to which verbs and verb phrases and all verbal projections denote sets of events, and extend that view to negated verb phrases. Now, why would we take the view that propositions are sets of events? Why would we take the view that sentences denote sets of events? Let me motivate that view a little bit more. And Chris was gracious to mention some of my previous work. I've worked on aspect, I've looked at forward verbals. People have talked about the fact that forward verbals are compatible with atelic predicates, but not with telic predicates. And I myself and many others have taken the view that this is due to a distinction between predicates, not a distinction between events. So there's no such thing as a telic event or an atelic event. There's only a distinction between a telic predicate, that is to say set of events, an atelic set of events. Okay, now, usually we take these sets of events to be specified by the verb phrase. And we think of built a house versus built houses, eat an apple versus eat apples, and so on and so forth, when we think of classic examples of telic and atelic predicates. But actually, it's been noted already in the 70s that sometimes the subject makes a difference as well. So not just the difference between 5A and 5B, but also the difference between 6A and 6B has to do with telicity, atelicity. But in 6A versus 6B, the subject is clearly partly responsible for the difference. What this means is that if we have a theory according to which telicity, atelicity is a matter of distinguishing properties of sets of events, and if forward verbals are sensitive to this distinction, then the forward verbals in 6 modify not just the verb phrase, but the entire sentence. And the entire sentence then, minus the forward verbal, denotes a set of events. No one can hear my cat right now. Okay, so one more set of evidence, one more piece of evidence for the idea that sentences, at least at some level, denote sets of events. This comes from work by Eitan Zweig at NYU in 2008 and 9. Eitan was working on dependent plurals, which are plurals that are co-arguments of another plural, as in unicycles have wheels. Wheels is a dependent plural here. And what's special about dependent plurals is that they can be paraphrased roughly as follows. Unicycles each have one wheel, and they don't all have the same wheel. That is to say, there's more than one wheel involved in total. So the challenge for theories of dependent plurals is how to get the more than one wheel inference, the multiplicity inference, to apply at the level of the entire sentence and not at the level of the dependent plural itself. That is to say, how to make sure that unicycles does not distribute over the more than one wheel inference. According to Zweig, this is because this inference is computed at the level of the entire sentence. But now Zweig notices that there is a problem with this theory if we assume that sentences denote sets of worlds or truth values. And that is because, without going into details, his theory requires there to be a difference between John's friends went to good schools and John's friends went to a good school. So think about the sentence, John's friends went to good schools. This sentence does not require any of John's friends to go to more than one good school, but it does require for there to be more than one good school overall. That is to say, it requires for it to be the case that there's one or more good schools, X, such that John's friends all went to X. Okay, and so now Zweig notices that within the context of this theory, the only way to generate the implicature that I just told you, 9a, that is to say, is by saying, okay, so we contrast this with what the speaker could have said, which is essentially John's friends went to a good school, or in other words, 9b, there is a good school that John's friends all went to. And so now normally we are used to implicature calculation. We have one sentence that was not said, one sentence that was said, and there's an asymmetric relation between these sentences. One of them entails the other, but not the other way around. But now 9a and 9b turn out to entail each other. 9a and 9b are equivalent. They're true in the same possible worlds. And so classically, there's no way to distinguish them. Well, Zweig finds a way to distinguish between them after all. And the key to that is that he takes 9a and 9b to denote sets of events. So that is the key here. That is what I'm importing from him, the notion that sentences denote sets of events. So according to him, 9a involves events in which there's only one school, but also events in which there's more than one school. Whereas 9b involves only events in which there's just one school. Okay, last bit of evidence, and this is something that I'm going to come back later on in the talk. This goes back to work I've done a few years ago with Lin-Min Zhang and Ivano Ciardelli. Suppose that you have a hallway with two switches and a light. And the light is controlled by the two switches. Imagine that right now, switch A and switch B are both up, and the light is on. But suppose that if things were different, then the light might be off. If switch A was down and switch B was still up, then the light would be off. If switch B was down and switch A was still up, the light would also be off. But if both switches were down, the light would be on. Suppose that that is given. Now, once again, if the switches are both up as they are now, or both down, the light is on. But if they are in different positions, the light is off. Right now, the switches are both up and the light is on, okay? Now, suppose I told you, if switch A or switch B was down, the light would be off. Would you agree? We asked people this in an experiment and 2/3 of them agreed. We also asked people, if switch A and switch B were not both up, the light would be off. Do you agree? And this time, almost nobody agreed with us. And intuitively, this is because with 10a, most of us tend to imagine that we're considering each switch at a time. And as we consider one of the switches, we leave the other one in its current position. That is to say, we only consider scenarios in which the two switches are in different positions. But with 10b, it seems that we are also considering a third scenario, one in which the two switches have both been toggled simultaneously. And of course, by assumption, in that case, the light would not be off. And that is why we don't agree with 10b, even if we agree with 10a. Okay, what does this have to do with events? Well, it turns out that if you take the antecedents of 10a and 10b, if you take them to be propositions in a classical sense, sets of worlds, then they are true in the same worlds. So this is a problem for the classical view. But suppose that we could consider two events to be in the antecedent of 10A. Each of these events corresponding to one of the positions of the switches in which the switches are in different positions. And suppose that we could add a third event to 10B, the event of both switches being down. Well, that would be a way to distinguish between the antecedents of 10A and 10B, even though the events in both of them are occur in the same possible worlds. That is to say, we can use sets of events to make a hyper-intentional distinction between propositions. Building on this, we can add a semantics for counterfactuals to account for this difference. So I'm going to come back to this. What I want to do now is go back to very first assumptions, go back to negation, go back to the idea that sentences denote sets of events, and think about what it means to be an event of not laughing, or not talking, or not P for any predicate of events P. But before I do that, let me pause for questions. If somebody could give me a sign that you're still hearing me, because I got no way to tell. Yes, thank you. Okay, wonderful. Let's keep going then. Okay, so I'm going to help myself to a few mathematical notions here. And by and large, these are going to be familiar to you if you are familiar with either Boolean algebra or lattice theory or mereology. But along the way, I'm going to point out those cases where we take a little bit of a different route. So let's help ourselves to a set of events. I'm going to call it an event space. This is going to be a complete distributive lattice ordered by what I'm going to call partude. This is going to be a partial order, so a reflexive and transitive and anti-symmetric relation. I'm going to assume that this is a complete lattice, which means that whenever I take a set of events, there's going to be an event that represents what I get when I put all of these events together, which is to say their least upper bound or their sum. There's also going to be an event that corresponds to their greatest lower bound or their product. Now, the sum of a set of events is what you get when you put these events together. As I said, the product is that part, that greatest event, which is a part of all of the events that I started out with. Now, what this means is that any set of events has a part in common. Now, of course, this is not very intuitive, so we're going to introduce a technical fix, which is a null part, a null event. The null event is part of every event. It is there for nothing, so to speak. Now we're going to write the sum of events with this symbol and a product of events with this symbol. We're going to use the symbol also as a binary relation because this is convenient, and same for the product. Now in any lattice, when you have these symbols, when you have these operations, they're associative, commutative, and idempotent. When I said we have a distributive lattice, what this means is that these two operations distribute over each other, which basically means that if you take two events or more and you put them together, you form their sum, then if you consider any parts of the sum, then these parts are going to overlap with one or the other of the events that I started out with. In other words, you can't generate new parts from nothing. There are no emergent parts, so to speak. So distributivity in this sense is actually not required for our technical results as far as I can tell. It's just there to make the system more well-behaved, to make the system more familiar to those of us who are familiar with mereology. Okay, very important. We are going to assume that some events do not occur. That is to say, we are minonionists or nonists about events, as the philosophers say. What does this mean? Well, events that don't occur are simply events like, for example, as I'm told, the construction of the Tower of Babel, or Nero's fiddling while Rome burned. or any other events that did not really happen. So that's the idea of an event that does not occur. Okay, now we're going to break new ground. That is to say, we're going to import notions that are not familiar from mereology. And here we're going to fairly closely follow the work of Kit Fine from truthmaker semantics, specifically his unilateral truthmaker semantics. But if you're familiar with this work, we're also going to deviate from it a little bit. And I might point out these cases. So think about the relationship between a raining event and whatever it is for it to be a non-raining event. Well, it's probably something that's pretty dry. Okay, so a raining event and a non-raining event cannot both occur. That is to say, they contravene or preclude or block or contradict or conflict with each other. I'm going to settle on a term exclude. So I'm going to help myself to a relation of exclusion between two events. This relation, I'm not going to define it for you. Instead, I'm going to introduce some assumptions on this relation, which I take to be natural and which, taken together, are going to reveal to us the nature of the exclusion relation. So the first assumption is if you have two events, E1 and F1, that exclude each other, and you have two other events, E2 and F2, and those two exclude each other, then the sum of E1 and E2 excludes the sum of F1 and F2. That is to say, exclusion is cumulative. This is a behavior that we are familiar with from mereology theories of transitive verbs. If John loves Mary and Bill loves Sue, then John and Mary love Bill and Sue. Next, we're going to assume that exclusion is symmetric. If any event, E1 excludes E2, then also E2 excludes E1. Okay, so the basic intuition behind this exclusion relation is if you have two events that exclude each other, then the occurrence of one of them prevents the occurrence of the other. If either of the two events occurs, then the other one doesn't. Okay. Importantly, we're not going to assume that exclusion distributes. And this is a point of departure from Kit Fine's truthmaker semantics. So if E1 excludes E2 and E2 is complex, that is to say, it consists of various proper parts, then it may or may not be the case that E1 excludes some of these proper parts too. Maybe E1 excludes only E2 as a whole and does not exclude any of the parts of E2. Maybe E1 allows each of the proper parts of E2 in isolation to occur, but does not allow them to occur together. Okay. Why is this? Why do we make this assumption? Let me justify it briefly, in part because this, like I said, deviates from Kit Fine's truthmaker semantics. So if you go to Genesis, the first book of the Bible, you're going to find lists like this. Adam begat Seth, and Seth begat Enosh, and so on. You're going to find long lists of genealogy. Now, if you're not a biblical literalist, you're not going to assume that any of these sentences describe events that occurred, okay? But even if you are a biblical literalist, you're not going to agree with me if I tell you that Enosh begat Adam, right? So Adam is the grandfather of Enosh. So Enosh cannot also be the father of Adam. There cannot be any cycles in the begetting relation. Okay, all right. So now, what does this mean with respect to my assertion that it's possible for one event to exclude another without excluding any of its proper parts? Well, let's imagine that there's one event of Adam begetting Seth, E1, let's say, and another event of Seth begetting Enosh, E2, let's say, and a third event of Enosh begetting Adam, E3, let's say. Now, keep in mind, these events don't occur. If you're not a literalist, you believe that none of them occurred. Even if you're a literalist, you will believe that the first and the second occurred, but not the third. The third is fictional. But why? Why is it that they cannot all three of them co-occur? Well, because the occurrence of any two of them excludes the occurrence of the third. That is to say, the sum of any two of these three events excludes the third. But that does not mean that any of these three events excludes any other of these three events. It does not mean, for example, that E1, the event of Adam begetting Seth, excludes E3, the event of Seth begetting of Enosh begetting Adam. No, these two events are compatible with each other intuitively. You can have any two of them, you just cannot have all three of them. And if you're not convinced that these are indeed events, well, think about the modified drop pattern that I introduced at the outset of the talk. We can repeat this pattern with these begetting sentences. From Adam begat Seth with Eve in 3800 BC or whatever, it follows that he begat Seth with Eve, it follows that he begat Seth, and so on. So we can run the same arguments, so these have to be events if anything is. All right, so remember we are taking propositions to be sets of events, and we're taking some events to occur and others not to occur. Okay, so we now have a notion of a true proposition. It's a proposition that contains at least one occurring event. Now, the notion of exclusion that I've introduced, I'm thinking of it as exact. By this, I mean that if E1 excludes E2, then each of these two events is wholly relevant to the excluding. That's an intuitive notion, not a technically precise notion, but it will be clearer, I think, if you consider what happens if you have two events, E1 and E2, and they exclude each other, and now you blow them up, you extend each of them. You consider some event that properly contains E1, so some event of which E1 is a part, and you consider some other event of which E2 is a part. Well, I'm now saying these bigger events, E1 plus and E2 plus, let's say, don't necessarily exclude one another. So for example, if I take two events, let's say, think back to 1948. In 1948, Truman and Dewey were the two presidential candidates in the United States. Truman won and Dewey lost. But Dewey could have won, and then Truman would have lost. In fact, there's a famous newspaper headline, Dewey beats Truman, which was famous because, well, it was what we call today fake news, and Truman got hold of the newspaper and he held it up and he showed it to reporters and he said something like, that's not what I was told. So the point is we have two events, Truman's victory and Dewey's victory. And now take any other event, the event of it raining today. Now you can form the sum of it raining today with either of the two victory events. And now what I'm saying is that the sum of it raining today and Truman's victory does not exclude, in the relevant sense, Dewey's victory and is not excluded by it. And the reason intuitively is that E1 plus in this case contains some extraneous material, some irrelevant material. However, it is useful to be able to say of two events that they each contain something where the two parts exclude one another. This is what I'm calling conflict. So in this case, the sum of Truman's victory and the weather does not exclude Dewey's victory, but it conflicts with it. And it likewise conflicts with the sum of Dewey's victory and anything else you want, and Adam's begetting Seth, for example. All right, so now with this notion of conflict, we can go further. We can rebuild our modality. We can define what it means for an event to be possible and impossible. And so here I'd like to suggest two views on impossibility, which are actually, they're actually inspired by the ancient Stoics. Turns out the Stoics had a logic which is similar to propositional logic and modal logic. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about it because everything that comes down to us from the Stoics is just fragments or hostile reviews. So if you're thinking about semanticists 2,000 years from now, if you're reviewing a paper negatively, make sure to at least include a summary, a concise summary of that paper, and please make it accurate because you never know, your paper might be the only one that survives. Anyway, so the Stoics have these two notions of impossibility. And I'm taking certain liberties here. So okay, two ways in which is if it conflicts with itself. That could be because it excludes itself, or because it has two parts of which one excludes the other, or anything like that. It conflicts with itself. So it has an internal contradiction, if you will. Let's call that internally impossible. So for example, the sum of Truman's victory and Dewey's victory is internally impossible. Okay, but now there's also something else. There's also another notion of impossibility. In the Stoics, the way the Stoics put it is something can be impossible if it is hindered by external factors. Now, what are external factors? Unfortunately, we don't know what they meant because none of their examples survive. But here's something that I'd like to suggest. If there is something like a law of nature, that is to say, a necessary proposition, and this necessary proposition is incompatible with an event's occurrence, then that event is externally impossible. It is hindered, its occurrence is prevented by something external to it. Or more generally, it doesn't have to be just one law of nature. Maybe at some worlds, later on we're going to introduce possible worlds, maybe at some worlds there are some propositions, and at other worlds there's other propositions, but let's imagine that necessarily, no matter where you are in logical space, some proposition prevents the occurrence of our event, and we're going to say that this event is externally impossible. Okay, we have these two notions, internally, externally impossible. Well, now I'm going to annoy you because just as you were getting used to them, I'm going to conflate them. I'm going to say they're going to collapse. And one part of this is simply the result of the assumptions we've made so far. I'm not going to go over the proof here. It's pretty short. In general, you can find all of the proofs in my talk in the handout. I'm just going to tell you the proposition. The proposition is any externally impossible event is also internally impossible. Or if you prefer, the other way around, any internally possible event is also externally possible. The intuition behind this is that if something is free of internal contradictions, then there is no law of nature that prevents it from occurring, at least in some possible world. That's why I call it plenitude. Okay, so the two notions, internally and externally impossible, are not independent. And now I'm going to simply flatten them, collapse them. I'm going to say they are the same. Oh, here's a lemma that's useful for something later on. I'm going to come back to that lemma in a bit. But so I'm going to flatten them by saying any internally impossible event is also externally impossible. Or if you prefer, any externally possible event is internally possible. I'm calling that accordance with nature. The intuition behind this, I mean, you don't have to pay too much attention to these names. I just find them cool. But so the intuition behind this is that if let's see, if you have an externally possible event, well, basically, the laws of nature are maximally lenient. Let's put it that way. Okay, so given that we have this collapse of internal and external possibility, we can drop the terms internal and external. We can simply speak of possible events and impossible events. Okay. All right. Now, imagine that I have a possible event which is not a proper part of any bigger possible event. That is to say, I have a maximal possible event. It might be a proper part of some even bigger events, but these bigger events will be impossible. Let's say you have such an event. I'm going to call this a possible world. This is a standard definition of possible worlds in those systems where possible worlds are not primitive but defined. So what I'm saying now is we can recover possible worlds from our events using these modal notions. Okay, now it turns out, and this is a lemma that I call Manichaeism, any possible world conflicts with any event it does not contain. Basically, a possible world says everything about everything in such a way that if an event is not part of a possible world, then it conflicts with it, which is to say it contains something that is excluded by some part of this world. Okay, we're going to make a few more assumptions and then we're ready to go to negation. We're going to assume, remember the null event, it's part of everything. We're going to assume it does not conflict with anything. So that's nirvana. So the intuition here is the null event by itself carries no information. If you carry no information, you're not contradicting anyone. We're also going to assume that if two events are each possible, but their sum is not possible, then they conflict. What does this mean? Well, think of events again as bodies of information. That's not what they are, but think of them as if they were testimonies, if you will. Think of two events as testimonies and imagine that a testimony is that each of these testimonies is free of internal contradictions. That is to say, each of them is internally possible. Therefore, each of them is also externally possible, by the way. But now imagine that if you put these two testimonies together, then it turns out that that is not possible. Okay, that's a fairly common situation in court and also in Kurosawa movies. So if we have two events that are each possible, but the sum is not possible, then we're going to assume that something in the first event excludes something in the second. If we didn't have this assumption, then it might be that as we put these two internally coherent testimonies together, we end up with something which excludes itself, let's say, or which has a part that excludes itself that overlaps with both events or something along these lines. And this is simply unintuitive, and so we don't want this. Somebody is asking, your system has no times? Oh, Ogihara, hi, you're asking, your system has no times. Could you show that events are absolutely needed even if you include times? I'm not going to talk about times today, but thank you for your interest. We do have an extension of this system to times that Timothée and I are working on right now. So ask me again in a couple of months and hopefully we should have a little bit more to say about this. By the way, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to just type them into the chat and I'll keep an eye on them. Okay. All right, I've told you what a possible world is. I'm going to say that two events are compossible or compatible, if you will, just in case their sum is possible. Just a way to say that they can both co-occur. They can both occur at the same time, in the same world, if you will. And then turns out that we need to make this assumption. It is not given to us for free. We're going to say that every possible event is part of a possible world. That's what I call cosmopolitanism. So no matter where you are in logical space, as long as you are in a place that's possible, you can always go upwards. You can always go from parts to wholes, and at some point you're bound to hit a possible world. Okay. So now what I want to do is give a non-standard logic for propositional language, for a propositional language using conjunction, disjunction, and crucially negation. Now, for conjunction, we're going to use a rule which actually is not new. Well, for one thing, it's a standard rule of truthmaker semantics, but from linguistics, it's familiar from places like Lazerson's 1995 book on event semantics, Haycock and Zamparelli's 2005 article on the semantics of noun coordination, and a few other places as well. I have a paper on the semantics of and. In that paper, I describe three theories of conjunction. This is what I've called the collective theory of conjunction. It's also sometimes called non-Boolean. This is as opposed to the intersective theory, which is also called Boolean, and the ambiguity theory, which is a combination of the two. So what we're doing here is a collective theory. The collective theory says that conjunction is defined in terms of mereological sum or fusion. Now, in our case, when we conjoin two propositions, we're going to do pointwise mereological fusion. We're going to say the conjunction of two propositions is a set of all those events that result from taking an event in the first and fusing it with an event in the second. For disjunction, we're going to just go with the usual rule and say disjunction is union. For negation now, we're going to do something new. And this is actually new even from the point of view of truthmaker semantics. So we are changing KIT system a little bit here, but we're doing it in what I think is a fairly natural way. Now, let me explain the rule. It looks a little bit daunting, but I hope it should be clear once you think about simple cases. So think about what we want to do. We have a proposition, the prejacent of the negation. The proposition is a set of events. We want to map this to another set of events. So we want to map P to not P. Okay, now let's imagine first that P is what you can think of as a definite proposition, a proposition that contains just one event, call it E. So what does it mean? What does it mean to be an event of not P if P describes just one event, just E? Well, we have the exclusion relation. So as a first step, think of not P as describing events that exclude E. Well, that's good, but not good enough, because maybe E is a very big event, a possible world, for example, even bigger. So we don't want to be dependent on there being an event that excludes this maybe very large E. So we're going to say, okay, let's assume that not P describes any event that excludes some part of E. Okay, not P describes any event that excludes some part of E. That's for the case where P only describes E. Now suppose P describes two events, E1 and E2. Well, what does it mean to say that P does not happen? P is not true. Well, it means that E1 doesn't occur and E2 doesn't occur. Now, what is an event of E1's not occurring and E2's not occurring? Well, it's an event that excludes some part of E1 and excludes some part of E2. Moreover, we want to make sure that our semantics is exact in the sense that an event counts as not P only if it has no irrelevant material to it. It should be an exact truth maker for not P. So what we're going to do is we're not going to just take any old event that has a part that excludes E1 or some part of E1 and has another part that excludes some part of E2. No, we're going to only take the sum. So we're going to start with any event that excludes E1 and any event that excludes some part of E1, excuse me, and any event that excludes some part of E2. And we're going to fuse them, and that's going to be a non-P event. That's going to be an event that negates P, as I'm going to say. Now, in general, there's going to be many ways to choose an event, because there's going to be many ways to choose something that excludes some part of E1, many ways to do the same for E2, and many ways to combine pointways. So any of these is going to be negating P. Now, what you find on 31 is exactly what I said, except we relax our assumption that P has only two events in it. P might have infinitely many events in it. And so what we're going to say is the same thing as what I said, but generalized. Okay. Now, what is it for an event to be a not phi event or not P event? Well, it simply means, you negate phi. So you're the sum of excluders of parts of all the things in phi. That's the semantic rule for negation. Now, using these semantic rules taken together, you can give a set of events, you can assign a set of events to any sentence in the logical language. And it turns out that from the assumptions that I've introduced previously, we can show that if a sentence is true, then the negation of that sentence is false, and vice versa, which is the the motivation that I started my talk with. We wanted to account for this behavior of negation. More generally, one can show that the same holds of conjunction, and not less surprisingly of disjunction, mutatis mutandis. In other words, the rules for conjunction and disjunction mirror the rules for these connectives in propositional logic. Another way to put this is the same formulas will turn out to be theorems, will turn out to be valid in propositional logic and in this non-standard logic for a propositional language. Okay, now let's go back to the two switches. Remember, the two switches were a scenario where right now the two switches are up and the light is on. And if either of them was down, the light would be off. But if both of them were down, the light would be on. Remember also that we found that participants agree with us that if A or B were down, the light would be off. But they disagreed that if A and B were not both up, the light would be off. Okay, so let's make things simple. Let's assume that switch A is up, describes just one event, the event of switch A being up. So it's a definite proposition. Same for B. Then by our rule for conjunction, we're going to also have just one event in the denotation of A and B, which is a fusion of these two. We're going to have each of these two events in a denotation for A or B, because that's just union. Now let's assume that there's only one event described by A is down, and that this event is excludes and is excluded by the event of A being up, and same for B. So that's fairly natural, I think. Then A is not up will denote just one event, namely the event of A being down. Similarly for B. And the disjunction of these two will then denote two events as before. Okay. Now remember that we assume that exclusion is cumulative, which means that since A down excludes A up and B down excludes B up, then the sum of A down and B down excludes the sum of A up and B up. Okay. Now remember also that A and B denotes a singleton of the event, which is the sum of A up and B up. Now, what is the denotation of not A and B? So what are the events that negate A and B, that negate the single event in A and B? Well, these events are any events that exclude some part of the highlighted event. Well, A down is such an event. A down excludes some part of the highlighted event, namely A up. Same for B down. But also A down and B down. A down fused with B down will exclude some part of the highlighted event, namely the highlighted event as a whole. And so for this reason, not A and B actually denotes a set of three events, while not A or not B denotes a set of two events. And this is just the asymmetry we need. Although these two sets will be true in the same possible worlds, where by true in a possible world, I mean containing an event that is part of a possible world. So although these two sets contain events that are parts of the same possible worlds, still they are different sets. So we're making a hyper-intentional distinction. We're making the distinction that we need in order to account for our counterfactuals. Okay, let's wrap up by mentioning a few payoffs of the system that I didn't have time to present today, and a few open questions that I'd love to hear your opinion on. So as I mentioned briefly, we can define notions of satisfiability and validity, and of truth, of course, and these turn out to be provably the same for the system as for classical propositional logic, which is to say that if a formula is a theorem of classical propositional logic, for example, P or not P, then it will also be a theorem of this non-standard logic, and vice versa. This means that everything that you know and love about classical propositional logic will still hold in some sense will still be recoverable from the system, but at the same time, we can make more fine-grained distinctions. We can make hyper-intentional distinctions than we can in classical logic. Likewise, we can make more fine-grained distinctions at the level of the consequence relation. Classical consequence remains available as the truth preservation across possible worlds, but at the same time, we can also ask when is a set of events a subset of another set. We can ask other questions, each corresponding to a possible way to define a consequence relation. I think this is, and Fine shows this in his work, so this is not novel, but I think this is very important for semantics because it may be that some of the time, maybe all of the time, when we ask ourselves whether a sentence follows from another one, we are not using classical consequence, we're using something more fine-grained. Think about the classical problem, the traditional problems of the fact that a necessary proposition entails every proposition. Well, this is not the case in this system. There's many different necessary propositions. I haven't talked about necessity so much, but you can find this later on the handout if you're interested. Another interesting way to develop this further concerns counterfactuals. So it turns out that the system of counterfactuals that I've presented here, it turns out that it behaves in non-trivial and arguably interesting ways when we apply it to propositions that denote non-singleton sets. So take something like if the light, if the match was struck, the light would be on. Sorry, if the match was struck, it would light. Sorry, it's getting late here. Well, so the way that we have set things up here, what this is going to reduce to is we're going to consider every event of the match being struck. And for every one of them, we're going to check whether it lights. So now at first sight, this is not what you want for counterfactuals, because some of these match striking events will be very remote. They will occur in some worlds which might be very different from the actual world. Worlds in which there's no oxygen, for example. And so we might say this is not what we want. And this quantification over all events in the proposition denoted by the antecedent is crucial for our account of the two switches scenario. Well, at the same time, if you think about those events that are described by the matches struck, well, in the actual world, the match is not struck. So these are non-occurring events. And in those worlds where these events do occur, they might be different from, well, these worlds might be different from the actual world. But if you look only at the closest worlds among them, these worlds might be sufficiently close for the events in question to be similar, relatively similar to the actual world or to, well, their counterpart in the actual world or something along these lines. More generally, we are assuming implicitly here that it is possible for an event to be a match striking event and yet for its properties to vary from one world to the other. In fact, we might even ask, is it possible for one and the same event to be a match striking event in one world and to fail to be a match striking event in another? This is tied up with questions surrounding modal fragility and modal robustness, which philosophers debate. So is it possible for an event to be only contingently a match striking event, for example? Something else that I haven't had time to present today is what is the relationship between the non-standard logic that you've seen and the classical propositional logic and its extension into higher order logic with lambda calculus, which we call Montague semantics. Well, it turns out that we can embed the system I've presented today into TY2, into Montague semantics, essentially, in such a way that we retain the classical denotations for conjunction, disjunction, and crucially for negation, side by side with the non-standard denotations that I've given today. So you can have your cake and eat it too. You can implement the ambiguity theory of conjunction. You can implement, if you want, a theory of negation according to which sometimes negation takes a set of events and maps it to another set of events along the lines of what I've said today. And in other cases, negation applies to a set of possible worlds and maps it to its complement, or it applies to a quantifier or to a truth value or what have you. So you don't need to go full-on truthmaker semantics. You can have a kind of localized part of your system that behaves in a truthmakery way, in the way that I've described today, and still keep all of the analyses that you have developed, that others have developed in TY2 and in intentional logic and so on. One interesting question, last question I want to mention, is it's common in TY2 to equip predicates with world parameters. We take, for example, a predicate like student to be not just a one-place predicate of individuals, but a relation between individuals and worlds, namely those worlds at which these individuals are students. And this is a way to get the classical notion of an intension, the set of all those worlds at which X is a student for some individual X. Well, if we want to go full-on truthmaker, or rather, if we want to go not just with the possible worlds, but with all of the parts of these worlds, with the events as I've suggested they are, then it also leads us to the question, what is the counterpart of this world parameter in that setting? So what is it for a student, for an individual, to be related by the student relation to something that is not a possible world, but a proper part of a possible world? This is actually something that my co-author and I have different opinions about. Arguably, semanticists should not have to answer these kinds of questions because they seem absurd. But then the question is, if they are absurd, should we build a system that prevents us from even being able to ask them? Or should we allow them to be asked, to be askable? And then in that case, how do we deal with the fact that we don't know how to answer them? So lots of things to ponder and to talk about. I'm very excited about this project. This is actually only the second time that I'm presenting it. So again, I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to present this work. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have about a half an hour for questions. And if you would raise your hand so I can call on you, that'll make it a little bit easier. Any questions from here first? Any questions from anybody online? Yes, you may.
I have a couple questions, but I'll ask one first. So you have mentioned the exclusion, which I think mirrors like a contradiction between propositions. What would you say about other types of relations between propositions? For example, like entailments. Can we still capture two events? If one happens, then the other one has to happen. Do we have that to capture?
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the question is there a way to define a relation between events which stands to entailment in a similar relation to that exclusion stands to contradiction? Is that right?
That's
yes.
Right.
Great question. Kit has answered this question in a way that has a natural implementation in our system. So let me share my handout again and I can show you what I mean. So first of all, we can define possible events as I've shown, and we can also define necessary events. So remember what it means to be compossible. For two events to be compossible means for their sum to be possible. And now we can define an event as necessary, just in case it is compossible with every possible event. And we can furthermore define an event as necessitating another event, just in case the first event is possible. And the second event is compossible with every event that's compossible with the first. Now that's a mouthful, but the idea is, given that the first event occurs, the second event is necessary. So Now, this notion is, it's in a way similar to entailment, because you can think of these events as bodies of information, as testimonies or databases, as I've suggested throughout the talk at various occasions. It's also interesting, by the way, to note that Kit has a result that throws some clarity on the notion of a possible world. So he shows that the assumption that I've called cosmopolitanism, which is to say every event is part of a possible world, is equivalent to something he calls conjunctive possibility, which is to say, for any set of events, if there's a possible event that necessitates every member of the set, then you can take the set and collapse it and form the sum, and that is a possible event. So more than you wanted to know, more than you asked in any case. But yeah, necessitation is the counterpart that you're looking for. Great question, thank you.
Okay, other questions?
Can I ask you a question?
Oh, sorry, who is taking the questions?
Oh, yeah, Ogihara-san, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your an interesting talk. I'm still fuzzy regarding your, important question number 10. So what do you claim to be the fact? You're saying that they should both mean the same, right? They are not.
Well,
And
I'm sorry.
you told us something about the statistical data.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Yes. Yes. Go over this
Sorry,
again.
maybe my connection. So what did you say is the difference between them in terms of people's reactions?
Sure. So, so essentially 2/3 of our participants at the time agreed with 10A, but only 20% agreed with 10B.
Or in terms of what? The claim? I mean, it's just a, what do you mean by agreement?
Judge it true. So what we did was this, we showed people a diagram of two switches and a light.
Uh-huh.
It shows that right now the two switches are up and the light is on. And it's accompanied by a text that explains that if just one of the two switches was down, the light would be off. But if both switches were down simultaneously, the light would be on. Then we asked them about 10A. We gave them 10A and we asked them to judge it true, false, or indeterminate. And we got some 2/3 of participants telling us that it was true. And for 10B, same setup, we got about 20% saying true. So this is a 2018 LNP paper I wrote with Ivano Ciardelli and Lin-Min Zhang.
Okay, I'll refer to that. My question then is about the differences between them. Is it possible that the difference has to do with the scope of negation and quantifiers?
Interesting. We've considered various options at the time. We assume that the way to represent the scope of negation in 10B is, as I've done here, that is, it is not the case that A and B are up. If we're wrong about this, then it should be something like A is not up and B is not up. So suppose that that is the correct scoping. Now, in that case, the sentence should also have been judged false, but this time simply because it would refer to only one counterfactual scenario, namely the one where A and B are both down, right? Where each of them fails to be up. And we had a way to guard against that. We made sure that this is not the case, essentially by having a variant of 10B where instead of off, we ask for on at the end. And in that case, participants also disagreed. They also judged this false or indeterminate at about the same rates as they did for 10b itself. In this way, we can tell that 10b actually quantifies not just over the both switches down world, but over all three kinds of worlds, including those where the switches are in different positions.
Okay, I'll take a look. Thank you very much. But you have to, quantifiers in the subject position too, because say if you say switch A or switch B, that's also a quantifier. And the same is true of switch A and switch B. So that might also give you different options. That's my sense. But I'll take a look. Thank you very much.
What is a quantifier that you have in mind?
Well, I mean, switch A or switch B, that's a quantifier, right?
Oh, you mean
that's
we modeled it in generalized quantifier theory?
Yeah, that's a generalized quantifier, so that could have some scope possibilities. And if you have, say, especially with regard to B, you have negation, and you also have both. So that, those three things may complicate the picture.
Yeah, so we've tried to catch all of these things at a time. I mean, we may not have, so I'd be curious to hear more about what you have in mind.
Okay, I'll take a look at your paper. I think I'm too slow to.
More about that.
Thank you.
I think that the relative scopings that you have in mind probably don't need us to talk about quantifiers, because it's indeed worth considering the option that we were wrong in modeling this switch A or switch B was down as.
Yeah, A is clearer because you don't have negation, right?
This, right? It might be that this is not the right scoping, that instead we should have not applying to A or B, in which case neither is done. But in that case, we should have complete disagreement with the sentence instead of almost complete agreement as we found. So for that reason, we think that that's not what went on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Chris Davis, can you go next?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for the talk, Lucas. If you addressed this or talked about it and I somehow missed it, I apologize. But with respect to the core examples, the 10A versus B judgments, I mean, obviously you posit the antecedent as being these logically equivalent things in the initial discussion, if we give it a kind of classic treatment. Superficially, at least, when I look at the judgments and the disagreement there, what it looks like, right, is someone's done some kind of embedded implicature. Basically, they've done something with some implicature involving disjunction inside of an antecedent, and the kind of obvious way to theorize based on that is in that kind of that way of thinking about it. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that, and also given the variability in the judgments for the disjunction case, the negated disjunction case. You said that 2/3 of the I'm sorry, it's been a while since I read the paper, but 2/3 of the participants, went in the way you would predict, or another way to say it is the way one would predict if they were doing the kind of embedded implicature on the disjunction. And then the other third did something else. Let's say, I mean, some percentage of them just weren't paying attention, or kind of, it was noise, but maybe it's more than just noise. And so I'm just curious about those two questions. How does this tie into the question about embedded implicature? Is this a different theory that gets the same thing done in these cases? And what about that variation in judgment? Yeah.
Thanks so much. Great questions. Here's what one would need to say in order to make the theory of embedded implicatures work. And here's why we didn't say it. One would need to say that in the case of 10A, the antecedent is interpreted as having the embedded implicature or not both, and not both, right? But not both. If switch A or switch B was done, but not both, the light would be off. Now, we would also need to assume that this embedded implicature is not computed in the case of an unembedded sentence, switch A or switch B was down. Now, this unembedded sentence We tested it separately. We simply asked people straight up, is this sentence true? And we gave them a scenario where both switches were done. And in that case, the majority of people did tell us that it is true. This is in agreement with the literature on unembedded disjunctions. Goes back to the 70s. In general, people tend to agree with these disjunctions being true in such cases. This can be manipulated in different ways. If you give them more time, their agreement goes down. So what would have to be said then is that the embedded implicature is computed by almost everybody, but the unembedded implicature, it fails to be computed by most people. As far as I know, none of the theories of embedded implicatures on the market predict this asymmetry. To the extent that they do predict an asymmetry, it's the other way around, where essentially the globalists predict that there should not be any embedded implicatures, and the localists allow them, but nobody allows only the embedded ones, or even a tendency for only the embedded ones. Second part of your question, what about the 33% that did not do the right thing, so to speak? So our intuition, for what it's worth, is that there is a separate reading of counterfactuals like 10A, and this reading is simply asking about the wiring of the switches, or more generally about the laws. It disregards the facts. It disregards the position of whichever switch is not under consideration at a given point, so to speak. And it only asks what would be possible, what would be the case rather, if the antecedent, well, if things were different from the actual world as far as the facts are concerned, no matter how they were different, never mind minimal change, never mind kind of ordering semantics restrictions that Stolniker, Lewis, Katza, and so on have all tried to model. So this is what we believe. This is what we think is going on. We have data that seems to support this, has to do with the difference between false and indeterminate, but it's more than I can go into right now, but it's all in the paper. So great question again. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, Shinya Okano has a question.
Yes, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I have a question about the interaction of disjunction and negation. So according to your definition in 31, it seems that an event, an impossible event can negate a set of events. For example, let P be consisting only of two events. It's snowing in Tokyo and it's hailing in Tokyo. Then there is a function which maps these events into two conflicting events. For example, it's sunny in Tokyo and it's raining in Tokyo. So then an event which has as its parts these two events, that is, it's being sunny in Tokyo and it's raining in Tokyo, can negate a set of events which consists of these. So is that what you intend to do? So is it okay for an event and chimeric event to negate a set of events which can correspond to the denotation of disjunctive sentence? Like
this is all correct, and this is all as intended. So one of the things that you may be picking up on is we countenance impossible events, and we extend what we say about possible events to these events in what we take to be the most natural way. Again, this is following Kit Fine's work on this point. The other thing that's worth highlighting that you may be picking up on is this. We don't take the relationship between an event and a sentence to be that of a minimal truth maker. Likewise, we don't take the relationship between an event and a sentence that it negates to be that of a minimal truth maker. If you forget about impossibility for a moment, if you just think about what it means to exclude an event, if you think about events as testimonies, the databases, or bodies of information, however you want to think about it. What does it mean to for one event to exclude such a body of information? Well, intuitively, it's the first event contains information that contradicts the second, but not in virtue of some internal contradiction. No, the first event consists entirely of information that contradicts some part of the second. Now, if you are faced with a testimony that you disagree with and you want to contradict it, what do you do? Well, one way to do it is you pick some part of the testimony that you disagree with and you say that's not true. Another way to do it is you pick several parts, maybe even all of those parts of the testimony in question. You say, this is not true, that's not true either, and so on and so forth. So there's no minimality requirement in the intuitive sense. There is no minimality requirement in our system either. This is as opposed to, for example, Angelika Katzer's system, in which she starts with situation semantics, which is based on the inexact counterpart of our truth-making relation, of our relation between an event and a proposition that describes it, that contains it. And then from this, she tries to get the minimal events. We are not trying to do that. We don't go for just the minimal events. So yes, if you have the sum of a raining and, what was it? A raining and a sun shining event. If you have that sum, you want to exclude it, then you want to negate the singleton of that sum, then you can exclude just the raining, you can exclude just the sun shining, or you can exclude both. And these three ways will be ways of generating events that negate the singleton of that sum. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Aviv Schoenfeld.
Yeah, thank you. So to go back to the counterfactuals, could you take us through the process of how the two different sets of events in 4, how do they lead to the differing judgments towards the pair in 10?
I didn't go over this. Basically, the key intuition is this: when we ask, is it true that if A or B was down, something would be the case? We're considering two possible scenarios. First, we're considering what would be the case if A was down, and in that case, we use a standard semantics for counterfactuals a la Stolniker or Lewis or Katzer to make sure that the switch that's not A, that is to say switch B, remains up because it is up in the actual world. We do the same thing for switch B. Now, the intuition for what would be the case if A and B were not both up is that there are 3 ways for that to be true. Just like there's only 2 ways for the disjunction to be true, now there's 3. One of these ways, crucially, will involve both switches being down. Okay, so that's how we get to the 2 different sets. Now, how to hook up these sets with semantics of counterfactuals? Well, there's 2 general strategies you can pursue. One is you go from each of the members of these sets, so each of the A down, B down, A down, and B down, to the proposition that this event occurs. So the classical proposition, that is to say the set of all those possible worlds at which this event occurs, which is just the set of all possible worlds that contain this event. You then feed this classical proposition into your favorite off-the-shelf semantics for counterfactuals, Stolniker, Lewis, Katzer, and so on. You get a classical proposition out of that. You then take this classical proposition, and there's ways to convert it back to a set of events if that is what you want to have at the end of the day. If not, you just have a classical proposition. That's also fine. It will make the same predictions. So this is a kind of circuitous route, but it has the advantage that you can use off-the-shelf theories of counterfactuals for that. There is also a theory of counterfactuals due to Kit Fine in 2012 that forgoes the need to go to the classical proposition level and works directly at the level of what we call sets of events. He speaks of states, but it doesn't matter. That semantics essentially is built around the idea of a transition between an event and an event. A transition between, for example, an event of switch A being down and an event of the light being, I'm sorry, a transition in this case between the sum of A being down and B being down, for example, and the event of the light being on. So he assumes that these transitions, each of these transitions is given to us as a primitive entity. And then from these transitions, he then builds up a semantics for counterfactuals that obviates the need for possible worlds. So you can go the moderate route and use one of the possible worlds-based semantics, or you can go the radical route and do everything at the level of truth makers, at the level of events, however you want to do it. There's some issues in either way. I've talked about these issues earlier. They result from the need to quantify over all of the members of the proposition. I've talked about that a little bit in connection with modal fragility of events. So I'm not saying that everything is solved there, and I would love to talk to you more if you have further thoughts about this, but that's the basic picture that we have in mind.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question if anybody has one. Yes, you may.
So curious, it seems that in your system, conjunction and disjunctions are not treated in parallel. Conjunction is creating some, but disjunction is to build more members, set members. So I wonder if are you going to extend that to other universal quantifiers, extensional quantifiers? So it seems like, because I'm thinking for the switch case, probably the judgment would be the same for like if not both switches are down, that would be similar for the negation over conjunction, and versus if one of switches if one of switches up, if one of switches down, will be similar to the disjunction over negation cases. So then, would you then also say that extensional quantification is like building set members, but universal is creating sums, something like that?
Yes, that's a natural extension. Again, Kit Fine has worked on this. There's a few technical issues and philosophical issues that arise. Basically, if you think about the relation between conjunction and universal quantification, let's say you have a domain with 3 members, Al, Bill, and Carl. Saying that Al, Bill, and Carl smiled is not the same as saying that everyone smiled, because in the second case, you're saying everything you said in the first case, but you're also saying that Al, Bill, and Carl are everyone there is, so to speak. So what this means at the level of truth making is that people have argued that in order to generalize conjunction to the case of universal quantification, it's not enough just to assume an n-ary conjunction where n is a number of elements in the domain. You also have to add something that some people, like Armstrong, for example, have called totality facts. The totality facts, the totality fact of a set is the fact that this set contains everything there is. And these facts then are taken by some people to be truth makers as well. So we would say they are events as well. And they are taken to be part of the events that make a universally quantified proposition true, or part of the events that are described by a universally quantified sentence, if you prefer. So yes, we would say this, but with some caveats.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all the time we have for questions. So I don't know how to thank somebody online. I will clap. You can go ahead and do a virtual clap if you want.